So having looked at international systems of law, we're now going to turn to look at Australia's legal system. Now, it's important to remember that within Australia, we have our 6 states and 2 territories at the state or regional level. And then at the federal level, well, we have the federal government. All of these governments regulate different parts of the Australian economy or the Australian business environment. And that's why it's very important to understand how this system operates, because that affects the application of law and how the law works with relation to business in Australia. So why don't we look at some of the key elements of the Australian legal system? And they're represented here in these bubbles. We can see that Australia is actually a liberal democracy. We have a common law legal system that we've been through several times. We're a constitutional monarchy, a federation. We operate with a separation of powers, particularly a separation of the judiciary from the executive and legislature branch, and we believe in responsible government as part of our system. So what do some of these terms actually mean? Well, with a liberal democracy, what we're talking about are laws made by, and the executive government consists of, elected representatives. So the people who make our laws are actually represented to those positions. And while they exercise those powers, they can't do it absolutely. They can only do it in line with the rule of law in Australia and the various constitutions that we have in place. That means that our elected leaders aren't free to do anything that they'd like. There are boundaries around it. And there's a legal term, right? There's a legal term which is called ultra vires. And what does that mean? It's a Latin term, and it means it's outside the power of the body. So it means that sometimes the federal government does something and it's considered ultra vires, that they didn't have the power to do it. So there are these curbs in a liberal democracy, such as that we have in Australia. We're also a common law legal system, and I think you've heard enough about the common law legal system for now. If not, go back and have a look at some of those earlier vodcasts. We have a constitutional monarchy. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means our head of state and the Commonwealth is the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, and she appoints a representative, the Governor-General in Australia, or the Governor at a state level. But that appointment, I mean, really it's done as a matter of convention, that there's a name put forward to her or recommended to her that she's really not going to shy away from, that she's going to take the recommendation of Parliament. So while we have, in some senses, this independent person on top who's appointed by the Queen, that person's recommended by our government. So for all intents and purposes, we are governed through a democracy, even though we have a monarch as our head of state. And that's different to an absolute monarchy, which we have in some countries, where the king or queen actually reigns and actually does make the decisions. Importantly, really importantly for our legal system, is we're a federation. So what does that mean? It means before there was an Australia, there were the colonies as we had then, or the states as we have now. And they actually came together and decided to become Australia and wrote down a constitution as to how we should work together. So the only reason we have Australia is that the various colonies of the time came together and agreed to do it. And as part of that, they also agreed the rules of the game as to how that constitution would actually operate. We have the separation of powers, which we went through in the last podcast. I won't go through that again. We just remember that the judiciary is entirely separate and should be entirely separate from our executive and legislative branches of government. We have a bit of a meld in the Westminster system, where the cabinet ministers, and we'll go through this in more detail, actually come from our legislature. So we don't have a strict separation of powers there between the executive and the legislature. We also have responsible government. Well, what that's trying to do is to get this idea of people being accountable. And the way that that works in the Westminster system is, rather than the head of the executive branch in the government being directly elected, like in a presidential model, or if you think about it like the Secretary of State in the US, their foreign minister, the Secretary of State really is only accountable to the President. In Australia, it's a different system, right? Because the people who are the heads of our departments, like the foreign minister, the foreign minister is an elected representative. So in some sense, they're accountable back to the people. And so what we have is this system of responsible government, whereby those who serve in the upper echelon, in the leadership positions of the executive arm, come from the legislature, and therefore they're responsible back and must answer the legislature, and they're also directly elected themselves. Okay, so what do we actually have when we look at our system in totality? You can see from this slide here that we're dealing with both federal and state levels. So it's not as though there's only one source of power. So what we can see is we have these two levels, the federal legislative power, the federal executive power, the federal judicial power, as well as a state legislative power, state executive power, and a state judicial power. And all of these elements of our legal system need to work together. And we've developed a number of rules, protocols, and laws to actually make sure that this occurs. For instance, can you think of one that we've talked about already? You know, one of the ones that we've talked about already is how statute overrides common law. So what you can see here is that we've got a rule in place whereby if we have a clash between federal legislative power and federal judicial power, we know what will happen. The federal legislative power will actually prevail.